Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Gary Novoselsky. I'm the chair of the Bergen County Green Party. I'd like to thank everybody for coming here tonight. Very good turnout, and thank you for your generosity. And we'd just like to let you know that the Bergen County Green Party meets in this room on the second Wednesday of every month at 7:30 p.m. So we're here on the right day. This is the second Wednesday, I think. And so next month we'll be back. Won't necessarily be a forum, but this is one in a series of forums that we've had where we try to present provocative speakers and we try to present timely topics, and in an effort to get everybody to think, and even more importantly, to encourage everybody to act. So once again, thank you for coming. One of the people very responsible for getting this evening's forum, getting it to take place, is Joe Pizzillo, who is our webmaster and high-tech. And I'd like to have him introduce Adam.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'll give you a little background, I guess. Adam reached out to the Bergen County Green Party months ago, maybe in November, I guess, when he was looking for some support, and basically to hold Rothman and Pasquale accountable for their votes on the free trade agreements. And ever since then, I've been on Adam's mailing list, and I tell you, this guy, he is tirelessly out there organizing events and protests and rallies, and I tell you, if they say we are the 90%, but this guy probably does 10% of the work of the 99%. But Adam Weissman, thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be joining you here tonight, here in Bergen County, where I grew up and first joined the struggle against corporate injustice and against the 1% that unfortunately are diminishing the quality of all of our lives. And as Joe said, we have had the opportunity just recently to collaborate with the Bergen County Greens in helping to bring the fight against corporate globalization to some of our, unfortunately, all too corporate complicit reps out here, like Steve Rothman. But we'll be talking about that a little more as we go on. So I work with an organization called Trade Justice New York Metro, which is a coalition of community, labor, activist organizations, immigrant community groups, environmental organizations, AIDS activist organizations, animal rights groups, united around the common agenda of fighting corporate globalization and challenging an agenda that's diminishing the quality of life for all of us, and that is giving more power to the corporations at the expense of the public interest. Just as of this October, we became part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I'll be talking a little bit more about how exactly that happened in just a moment. Okay, once I figure out how to get this to advance. There we go. Doesn't seem to want to load the second slide. It did, and then yeah.
My name is Brooke Harper, and I'm the Senior Field Organizer for Public Citizen.
My name is Adam Weissman. I work with Trade Justice New York Metro. We are a coalition of community, labor, and religious organizations in New York City, representing a broad spectrum of social movements opposed to the unfair NAFTA model of trade. We fight against trade agreements that endanger our environment, violate human rights, limit access to medication, undermine the survival of family farms while expanding unsustainable factory farms that benefit major corporations.
Tell me, what is a TPP specifically?
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade agreement between 9 countries currently. They are Jerusalem, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Peru, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And right now, the reason why we're so concerned about it is because we don't exactly know what's in this trade agreement, and trade agreements can affect everything from our access to medicine to our environmental laws and policies and many things in our everyday lives that we don't think that trade agreements affect, they do. They go a lot farther than beyond just tariffs.
Now, if this model of free trade deals is a failed model that has caused so much damage to the majority of the populations in the United States and other countries, why do you think the Obama administration continues pushing this? Is there any relation between Wall Street corporations and the policies of trade in the U.S.?
Yes. I think calling this a failed model of trade in a way is almost misleading, because I think it's been a very successful model of trade. It's done exactly what the corporations wanted it to do. It's helped corporations outsource jobs, lower environmental and safety standards. It's helped corporations undermine all of the public interest legislation that we, the people, the 99%, have worked very hard to achieve. So I think it's actually been enormously successful in what it intended to do, which is destroy democracy and undermine the public interest for the benefit of corporate profits. And one clear example of that is the financial industry, which has used these trade agreements to lock in rules against regulating financial services, locking in rules that prevent us from banning too big to fail, that prevent us from banning toxic derivatives, that prevent us from banning capital flight, all very necessary measures that could have prevented the financial crisis and will hopefully help us prevent another economic meltdown. But things that the financial industry doesn't want, because it will help force them to move away from the casino economy that created a lot of profits for a lot of the super rich in a short time, but destroyed the economy for the rest of us and helped promote 9.1% unemployment.
As a candidate, President Obama was anti-free trade agreements, but now his government seems to be pushing more and more of this model.
Yes. Well, Obama did say that he was going to usher in a trade agreement that was a representative of the 21st century, and it would be ushered in with great transparency and high labor standards. But from what we've seen from texts that we've seen, that isn't the case. And so we really want to make sure that activists like myself and my organization and everywhere are educated about this issue, and that they hold Obama to keep his promise to usher in a new era of transparency in trade.
Today there was a hearing that you mentioned here at the Congress. What do you think will take for this bill to be passed, and when do you think this will be debated in Congress?
Well, with Congress, it'll be an up and down vote if they have fast track. I think they're going to need first to implement fast track authority to renew that for Obama in order for this to get through. And I also think it's going to take the countries a long time to negotiate this, just because many of the countries already have existing FTAs and bilateral and multilateral treaties with one another currently. So I think that they're all going to be trying to protect their interests. So this trade agreement will take a long time to be negotiated. I think we can influence our Congress by asking them to appeal to USTR for more transparency and to allow us to see the text, and for stakeholders and the 99% to have a say in these trade agreements.
What can people, anyone, the 99% can do in order to prevent this model to continue growing?
Well, I think with TPP now in negotiations, and with a vote just being taken in October on the Panama, South Korea, and Colombia free trade agreement, it is absolutely essential that people in the United States hold our elected officials accountable for how they just voted. The politicians did not want voters to know about these votes. That was reported on in the Capitol Hill media, that they were hoping these votes would go quietly because they know that the majority opposes.
I don't know what just happened.
You didn't touch the computer often enough, and so it went into sleep mode.
Oh no.
So you have to keep jiggling it every once in a while. Yeah. About every 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah, I wish I knew that. Thank you.
My name is Brooke Harper, and I'm the Senior Field Organizer for Public Citizen.
My name is.
I don't know how to skip to the end of the video, so we'll just skip the rest of the video. We're towards the end anyway. Let's just go on.
My name is Brooke
Let
Harper.
me just get back to it. Hopefully things will. Okay, yeah. Well, before we get to that, okay, go ahead. Ask your question.
Well, I noticed a couple of the pictures, and some of the people's hands were tied with the zip ties. But they are all in a row, and the cop walked by and sprayed everybody, and they were there with their hands in their zip ties, but they weren't covering their faces. Now, what did they do? Did they tie their hands to their crotch? Or were the people told not to cover their face, or is this photo a setup? That's my problem. Because if someone was coming down a pike at me with one of those things, I would cover my face.
I think it may just be something that things that happen quickly and people don't necessarily have that reaction time. What this picture is here to show, though, is when first looking at this image, it looks very familiar. It looks like something we've seen an awful lot of in recent months. But this picture is not a picture that was taken in recent months. This picture is, in fact, over a decade old. This picture was from the Battle of Seattle in November and December of 1999, when about 45,000 people took to the streets of Seattle to shut down a meeting designed to strip us of our basic democratic rights and take power away from the laws that we've fought for, the laws that protect our environment, that protect farmers, that protect the safety of our food, and instead create an international system that puts the right of corporate trade and profit above all else. Well, the people didn't stand for it, and as a result, we had one of the greatest victories of social movements in the recent history of this country. Now, when looking at Occupy Wall Street, one of the first things that a lot of people thought who had the Battle of Seattle in mind was that this, again, looks very familiar. Once again, the people are seeing that the corporations are not satisfied with the power and wealth that they already have and are using every strategy possible to consolidate and expand their power at the expense of the rest of us. And we can see here who are some of the corporations on this list on the left side who have been some of the strongest advocates of free trade agreements, are some very familiar names. These are some of the names that have come up time and again in the few short months that Occupy Wall Street has been active. Companies like Pfizer has been protested, I think, by Occupy Wall Street on about three separate demonstrations on 3 different issues. J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, the same companies that wrecked our economy and caused this massive unemployment are the same companies that are pushing for free trade agreements. Now, on the other side, here are the people who have been fighting against these trade agreements. Human rights advocates, environmentalists, family farmers, indigenous groups, labor unions, peace activists, in other words, the 99%, those of us who believe that there are things more important than making the billionaires make more billions. Corporate globalization has been presented to us as the wave of the future, as an inevitable course, just the way the world is going to go. But this is a lie. This is corporate propaganda. Things got this way because of active corporate lobbying, because of rules that were written not just to open markets and not just to create a level playing field for trade, but written specifically for the advantage of corporations with a particular agenda in mind. The corporations wanted cheaper labor so that they could lower their costs and increase their profits. So they knocked down any barriers, like tariffs, that could prevent them from doing that. They've used trade agreements to attack labor laws and to attack labor rights. They've also used trade agreements through their investment rules and through their ability for challenges of national laws to attack the laws that we've worked so hard to protect. Laws preventing us from toxic chemicals, laws protecting wildlife, laws that keep our food safe. They've instituted a system that essentially says that the rights of corporations supersede the rights of just about everyone else. Now, Wall Street loves these trade agreements. It's no coincidence that we in Trade Justice have chosen to be part of Occupy Wall Street because we're really fighting the same enemy. The Korea Trade Agreement, which was just passed in October, has a whole bunch of benefits for the big corporations. They built in rules that prohibit regulating the financial industry. The trade agreement's investment rules give corporations the power to sue for unlimited sums in unaccountable international tribunals for profits that they could have potentially made in the future if we didn't pass laws to protect us from them. The same corporations whose bailouts we financed lobbied for a trade agreement that makes them even more unaccountable to us because, I guess, they assume we'll just bail them out again the next time. They blocked rules against too big to fail. They blocked rules banning the sale of toxic derivatives. They blocked rules that would have allowed for sensible capital controls. And looking at the list of corporations who've lobbied the most and put the most money into lobbying on these trade agreements, some very familiar names. It's people like J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, the same people we've been bankrolling. Free trade agreements have had a disastrous effect on unemployment in the U.S. They've helped further the trend of the loss of industrial jobs in the U.S. and the elimination of the U.S. as a manufacturing nation, as more and more jobs are outsourced to sweatshops, where corporations can profit off of brutally exploitative labor conditions. NAFTA was a huge job killer, and pretty much everyone in this country knows that, which is why, from left to right, people in this country do not like these trade agreements. Whether they're concerned about international social justice or the environment, just about everyone gets that free trade agreements mean less jobs at home. That's why 65% of union members oppose trade agreements, but even more interestingly, 61% of Tea Party members oppose them too. But who really benefits? We're told that these trade agreements will make our products cheaper. So we may have less money, but the products will be cheaper too. But studies have shown that whatever cost savings are passed on to consumers through sweatshop labor aren't keeping up with our stagnant wages. So our products may be cheaper, certainly not cheap enough based on what they're paying for labor, but we're not making the money to pay for them. Free trade agreements are disastrous for the environment. Corporations have time and again used the investment rules in these trade agreements to sue countries when they've tried to stop toxic mining projects, when they've tried to stop the importation of cancer-causing chemicals. Companies like Dow have used these trade agreements, Metalclad, Methanex. There are just an endless series of disturbing cases. We don't have time to get into that in full detail now, but if you look at the website gjae.org, there's a detailed presentation that lists some of the worst cases. They also encourage foreign investment in extractive industries and increase development of oil, mining, gas, logging, and again give these corporations the power to challenge any protective legislation that might get in their way. Trade agreements also expand industrial-scale factory farming by lowering agricultural tariffs. So the Smithfields and Tysons can export more of their toxic products, can breed more swine flu and bird flu, can pollute our air and water more, can contribute to global warming, and create an overall net increase in consumption both of factory-farmed animal products, but also of animal products in general, which is disturbing when you can think about the fact that recent studies suggest that 51% of climate change is attributable to animal agriculture, and the developing world is increasingly moving towards an animal product heavy diet because of this massive export of subsidized, now untariffed, industrially produced animal products. In the process, of course, family farmers are being destroyed. Free trade agreements are also an attack on people with AIDS and other people with life-threatening illnesses. As much as they talk about these agreements being free, in reality, in many ways, they're just the opposite. One of the effects of these trade agreements is they expand corporate intellectual property rights, they expand drug patents, they build in data exclusivity so that corporations can hide their research data, making it harder for people to get affordable medications, making it harder for governments to pay for the medications for government-sponsored drug programs. These trade agreements are, for many poor people, a literal death sentence. Trade agreements are a direct attack on localism, on trying to support local economies, on the idea of trying to be more sustainable by buying local. Many of these trade agreements actually ban buy local measures. They also privatize public services. Right now, as a direct result of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, there's a major fight in Colombia against the privatization of education. They also attack our national and local sovereignty. We don't have the final word on our laws anymore. The final word on what laws we are allowed to have or not have are going to be decided by the World Bank through its International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or a UN arbitration court. That might be a nice thing if what they were arbitrating was based on a standard around human rights or environmental sanity, but that's not the way these rules are written. These rules are written as basically corporate profit liberales. So Occupy Wall Street Trade Justice Working Group grew out of Trade Justice New York Metro, which I've mentioned a few times, which is a coalition that's been around since about 2002, which itself grew out of an older coalition called the Global Sweatshop Coalition. So throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, the Global Sweatshop Coalition was a coalition of Latin American solidarity, human rights, social justice groups working together to fight the exploitation of workers in sweatshops. But we eventually expanded our mission when we realized that the free trade zones, which are zones set up for production of products for export by foreign investing corporations, where essentially labor laws are off the table, tariffs are eliminated, environmental laws are conveniently ignored. We realized that through these free trade agreements, these free trade zones were essentially becoming the entire world. After the Battle of Seattle, when President Bush realized that he wasn't going to be able to move ahead with expanding the World Trade Organization even further towards enfranchising on our rights and the laws that we care about, he moved his focus towards trying to do regional free trade agreements. So he first tried to push a free trade area of the Americas. Well, Brazil and Mexico, Brazil didn't think that was such a good idea, and a lot of other Latin American countries didn't think that was such a good idea, which is a big part of why we've seen more and more progressive governments elected in South and Central America. So then he started going piece by piece. He started pushing a Central America free trade agreement. That was already something he was trying to do before, on the way towards FTA, the free trade area of the Americas, but it eventually became clear that he wasn't going to get that whole hemispheric block. He did pass in 2005 the Central America Free Trade Agreement. Then in 2006 a free trade agreement with Oman, an absolute dictatorship where labor unions are illegal. This is the same president who took us to war in the apparently interest of democracy, or so we were told, after we were told it was about weapons of mass destruction. Then in 2007 he passed a free trade agreement with Peru, a country whose president said that indigenous people claiming rights to their land and defending the environment are like barking dogs in an orchard, trying to keep people from picking the fruit even though they are not going to use it. He considered it unfathomable that people should see the environment as anything other than resources for profit. As soon as he was able to pass a free trade agreement with the U.S., he used that as a pretense to pass a decree that was in effect a massive land confiscation from indigenous people on behalf of extractive industries, which led to a massacre of indigenous people when they rose up to defend their lands. After that, Bush tried for the remainder of his term to pass trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, which there wasn't the political will to do under his administration, but Obama fixed that for him. So we, for basically the last decade, have been fighting these trade agreements. It's been a very difficult uphill battle against corporate interests. And then, as we were coming into the home stretch, and it was becoming abundantly clear that President Obama was going to break every campaign promise he made about fixing our nation's broken trading system, about renegotiating NAFTA to make it work for U.S. workers, and was in fact going to finish Bush's unfinished dirty work. At just around that same time, and before I move ahead, actually, I want to add a little detail. Some of you may remember why Obama lost the Ohio primary. Does anyone remember why Obama lost the Ohio primary? Right. Obama was sending mailers to people in Ohio with pictures of shuttered gates, talking about Hillary Clinton's support for NAFTA and how Hillary Clinton, a vote for Clinton was a vote for more job-killing trade agreements. Meanwhile, it was leaked that Obama's advisor was up in Canada telling the Canadian government that it's just campaign rhetoric, and he doesn't really mean it. People in Ohio apparently weren't too big on that. So, Obama, our liar-in-chief, as of October 3rd, sent the three trade agreements he previously described as unconscionable to Congress to be voted on. That was, if anyone remembers, just a couple days after Occupy Wall Street was started on September 17th. So as we were going into the home stretch, we saw the opportunity for a confluence, thousands of people taking to the streets against Wall Street, and Wall Street pushing a trade agreement that was going to make it illegal to regulate Wall Street. So we decided to go down to Occupy Wall Street and let people know what was going on. And
we're here in Freedom Plaza, just around the corner from Wall Street.
This is our first teach-in from our first teach-in at Occupy Wall Street.
With three people who are here from three different countries talking about so-called free trade agreements. Why don't you introduce yourselves and talk about where you're from?
My name is Carlos Salamanca, Mingas, New York,
Sorry for the quality of the video.
And you're from Colombia?
From Colombia, yes.
Hi, my name is Hak Jung Ha, and I'm with Noruto for Korean Community Development and an organization that's national called Korean Americans for Fair Trade, and I'm a second-generation Korean American.
And my name is Sunyata Denor. I live in the South Bronx. I work with the Latin American and Caribbean Community Center, and I'm from Panama.
You are here doing a teach-in on so-called free trade agreements. Talk about your concerns. There's going to be a vote on them on Wednesday.
Yes. This Wednesday, the House of Representatives will be vote on these 3 trade agreements. We are calling everyone to call the Congress people to vote no.
Why are you concerned about the agreement on Colombia?
Basically because with these 3 agreements, Colombia open and expand more the market for the multinational corporations and financial corporations from the United States, and is the continuation of what's going on in Colombia, is supporting the government who are not doing anything to stop the killing of the workers in Colombia, the union members, the human rights activists, and the persecution against the indigenous and Afro-Colombians leadership over there.
South Korea.
Yes, well, for myself and many Americans who are also tied to Korea, the free trade agreement with South Korea represents this exactly the types of agreements that everyone here at Wall Street is opposed to. Basically, it bans a limit on the size of financial institutions. It bans any limit on capital flows. It bans it bans any regulation on derivatives. So essentially, it tries to institute once more the things that caused this financial crisis in the first place. And it also opens the door to outsourcing more American jobs. And it has caused a lot of depressing of the standards of life and of the laws in South Korea as well. They had to lower their emission standards. They had to lift their ban on GMOs and their the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms, and a lot of bioengineered foods. And basically, a lot of the laws that both Americans and Koreans have fought for are going to be basically become meaningless in the face of these free trade agreements. And just last week, 10,000 people in South Korea went to the streets to protest these free trade deals. But both governments seem very intent on pressing forward. And I think not enough Americans know about the damage that these free trade agreements will cause, and really not really looking even in their own backyard at what NAFTA has done.
So you have to talk about that.
Sure. I think it's great that we're here at Occupy Wall Street, in particular because the U.S. military has basically occupied much of Central America and especially Panama over the last several hundred years. And one of the things to remember with the administration, with the current administration in Panama, with President Martinelli, is that he has no restraint whatsoever over the country's natural resources, passing a law earlier this year that opens up foreign investment in mining. And last year also passed a law that essentially weakened already decrepit labor standards in the country. And so we're dealing with a president in Panama who doesn't respect workers, who doesn't respect unions, and who really is more supporting the government and international business and developing his own workforce, and with the U.S. government who is, or specifically the Obama administration, who's been pushing really hard around these free trade agreements where they can basically make it legal for capital to move around the world unregulated. And the other thing about Panama is that it's the second largest tax haven in the world, so international corporations who do business there because they avoid paying taxes. They do business there because they avoid paying a living wage, paying minimum wage, or having even work environments that are healthy for the workers who are there in order to make more profits. And so you have an occupation happening in Panama by the current administration, an outside occupation again coming from the U.S. that has been there since 1989 when the U.S. invaded Panama and completely demolished their military. And so we weaken infrastructure, and I mean, it's just no good for anybody. It's no good for the workers here in the U.S. It's no good for the workers in Panama.
We're still
So a lot lot of these points were covered, so we'll just go through this quickly as to why these three trade agreements are so destructive. The U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement is the biggest free trade agreement. Biggest free trade agreement the U.S. has passed since NAFTA. South Korea is a major trading partner of the U.S. It's a major industrial country. So in terms of its impact on the U.S. economy, this is not like passing a free trade agreement with El Salvador or Guatemala. This is a major hit. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement is going to lead to the outsourcing of 159,000 U.S. jobs. Now, where are those jobs going? You would think Korea, right? That would seem logical. Well, no. Because the rule of origin built into this trade agreement says that only 35% of a product actually has to be made in the country it's being exported from to be exported tariff-free. Well, what does that mean? It means that Korea can outsource production to Vietnam, Indonesia, China, North Korean sweatshops, and then conveniently export those goods to the U.S., labeled Korean-made, tariff-free, so that U.S. workers are now competing with cheap goods manufactured in overseas sweatshops exported into the U.S. tariff-free. But wait, it gets better, because it works both ways. So that means that U.S. corporations can outsource U.S. jobs to Mexico and other sweatshops, and then export those goods to Korea tariff-free. So basically, U.S. workers are getting squeezed in both directions. And they conveniently made sure that things like International Labor Organization rules would be locked out of the trade agreement, nothing that could actually increase costs by respecting human rights for workers. The U.S. International Trade Commission, not exactly a friend of the trade justice movement. It has made it a practice of cheerleading every economically destructive free trade agreement that comes down the pike. Even the ITC had to admit that this one is going to increase the U.S. trade deficit. Didn't stop Obama from passing it, obviously. But Korea trade agreement is scary on another level. Korea has now an annual ritual of mass culls of livestock because Korea has increasingly moved towards factory farm agriculture to compete with imports. These mass culls are because these factory farms are breeding disease. Diseases like bird flu, diseases like hoof and mouth disease. So what happens when U.S. agribusiness producers are now able to export their factory farm products to Korea tariff-free? What little is left of Korean farming that is not factory farmed is eliminated. Korea moves even more intensively in the destructive direction of factory farming. And we need to start taking very seriously things like the World Health Organization warning about the fact that there is a potentially epidemic case of bird flu headed towards the Korean peninsula that could reach epidemic potential and kill tens of millions of people. And so, we're no reason we should be worried about that. The fact that NAFTA killed about 18,000 people by encouraging Smithfield Foods to outsource their hog farms to one of their hog farms to Veracruz, Mexico, where they could get around those nasty U.S. environmental and safety laws, set up a super toxic factory farms that would incubate disease and create an epidemic that has created a massive death toll. That's not something we should worry about, right? The hog industry's major response, as you may remember, to the swine flu outbreak was not anything like maybe we should change our practice. It was we should make sure that this disease is not called swine flu, because that sounds bad for us. Oh, and as Suk-jung mentioned in the video, the trade agreement is also a massive attack on Korea's domestic laws. Its auto emission standards, rules, she mentioned the genetically modified food. So once again, sovereignty undermined in the interest of corporate profits. The U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement has been among the most controversial of these agreements. Colombia has the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere. 5.2 million people have been internally displaced by paramilitary narco-terrorist death squad groups. These are people who are violently forced off their land so that their land can be claimed for corporate interests, for plantation agriculture, for extractive industries, etc. The Afro-Colombian communities have been among the hardest hit. Indigenous communities have also faced displacement, intimidation, and mass murder. Something like 16,000 Colombian civilians have been assassinated. 3,000 labor organizers, roughly 3,000 labor organizers have been killed in the last 30 years or so. In the first 10 months of President Santos's, the current president's administration, over 100 civilians were assassinated, including children. President Obama, who again said that this trade agreement would be unconscionable to pass when he ran as a candidate, decided to address this by putting in place a labor action plan that was supposed to address some of the labor abuses in Colombia. Of course, overlooking the fact that journalists are being killed, indigenous people are being killed, Afro-Colombians are being displaced, the Amazon is being destroyed by corporations, all issues that are major, that are not addressed by the labor action plan. But moreover, he decided to go ahead and pass the free trade agreement anyway without anything actually building the labor action plan into it, showing his deep commitment to labor and human rights. He's now, the labor action plan was negotiated with the Colombian government. He's talked about that the labor action plan would have to go into effect before the trade agreement was implemented and put in place various reforms. Well, since the trade agreement was voted on in October, there have been ongoing killings of union organizers. Recently, another Coca-Cola union organizer was assassinated. That seems not to have stopped President President Obama from his enthusiasm for apparently planning on implementing the trade agreement at the Summit of the Americas this week. Panama Free Trade Agreement, as we heard, is going to make it even easier for the 1% to hide their profits in overseas banks. It bans things like limiting money transfers, so that there will be nothing to stop corporations from hiding as much money as possible in Panama, which has a convenient dual tax system. One tax system for the people of Panama, another tax system for foreign corporations and rich people hiding their money. It's also very convenient because the drug cartels, who will be able to expand their profits as a result of the Colombia trade agreement, will be able to launder their drug money through increasingly launder their drug money through Panamanian banks. So, TPP pop quiz. What does TPP stand for? We heard about it, got a little bit in the opening video. Taking people's power, transferring production plant, outsourcing jobs to sweatshops, totally poisonous provisions that will undermine food safety, terribly pricey pharmaceuticals, limiting access to generic drugs, and trashing procurement preferences, banning rules like Buy America and green purchasing rules. We are not privy to the TPP negotiations. Civil society, NGOs, none of us get to be part of this negotiation. None of us are allowed to find out about this negotiation until 4 years after it is ratified by Congress. Basically, we get to see the final text of the agreement, but we are completely locked out of the negotiating documents. But guess who isn't? 600 corporations. Corporations who've put lots of money, we can see through their disclosures, into lobbying to make sure that these trade agreements have nice, strong intellectual property rules for pharmaceuticals and all the other kind of rules that are helping the rich get richer at the expense of the rest of us. Well, they didn't admit that. That was through a leak. Basically, about all we know about this trade agreement is through WikiLeaks. And it's pretty clear why they don't want us to know about this trade agreement. Basically, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is kind of like NAFTA and CAFTA and all these other trade agreements, stripped away, it seems, of what little concessions the Democrats were able to get into these trade agreements to give themselves political cover when they sold out to the corporations. Since the Peru trade agreement, they built in a couple little rules here and there, some environmental rules, some labor rights, some rules around access to medicine that made the trade agreements a little bit less odious. Lori Wallach from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch described this as like putting icing on a rotten cake, because the core of the agreement stayed the same. As with past trade agreements, these trade agreements will have the noxious, toxic investor-state system that gives corporations the right to sue in international tribunals. One of the reasons this is interesting is because this 9-country agreement includes countries that already have trade agreements with the U.S. that don't include investor-state provisions, countries like Australia. Begs the question, because part of the reason those investor-state rules were supposedly put in the first place was on the premise that some countries don't have significantly developed court system to handle these kind of international cases. Australia has a pretty developed court system. So maybe that wasn't really the intent. You can see the range of countries here. Brooke described them earlier. So these are the ones we know. These are the ones that are already in the agreement. Brunei, Vietnam, lots of sweatshop exports. Malaysia, lots of rainforest to chop down for oil palm plantations. New Zealand, Australia, Peru, Chile. We already have trade agreements with Peru, Chile, Australia, Singapore, but basically this is an opportunity to make those trade agreements even worse. Who else wants to get in on this trade agreement? Canada's looking to get in, Mexico, Japan. Indonesia's talking about it, they're not too enthusiastic about it. This is basically designed as a docking agreement. This is the trade agreement for the 21st century, so that they set up the model and then other countries can join. Who are they talking about maybe bringing in long term? Yep. China. Yeah, that's apparently Obama's jobs plan there. Free trade agreement with China. But the truth is, this deal is not about trade. If you look at the countries who are in this trade agreement at this point, most of them we already have free trade agreements with, and the ones that don't have tiny economies. So how is this going to increase U.S. exports? How is this going to create jobs? It's not going to. It's going to give corporations more place to outsource jobs to sweatshops. It's going to give corporations more opportunities to exploit the environment and violate people's rights. We covered this already a bit. This talks about some of the particular cases. The Pacific Rim case is one we'll be getting back to a little later. This is a case where El Salvador was sued for something like $70 million in an international tribunal. El Salvador is a tiny, poor country, for saying that a mining company could not mine with cyanide and arsenic near the river that's its largest drinking water source. A lot of people said that it's quite possible. Oh, an interesting thing about that case, the company who brought the case through the U.S. Central America Free Trade Agreement is a Canadian company. How'd they do that? Canada's not part of that agreement. They set up an office in Las Vegas. Problem solved. And again, TPP will limit access to medications and actually directly undermine President Obama's supposed programs to alleviate global AIDS. Buy American, undermined, again. More outsourcing of jobs. Really hardcore intellectual property rules that has a lot of people worried who are concerned about things like internet freedom. More financial deregulation. The same corporations that lobbied on the Korea agreement are lobbying big time on this one. We read it in their financial disclosures, in their lobbying disclosures. They don't hide it. That they don't hide. Now, it is important to remember, because this is all pretty depressing, that this is not inevitable as much as they want us to think it is. We did make a difference in Seattle. We did derail the progress of the WTO. And that wasn't the only time. The Multilateral Agreement on Investments, dead on arrival. The FTAA, thanks to people's movements, dead. Then they tried to shrink it down to the Andean Free Trade Agreement. Ecuador wasn't going to do that. We can win this fight. And people all over the world are taking up the fight against TPP, both in the countries that are already actively party to TPP negotiations, and even in countries that are considering being part of TPP. We should take guidance from Japan. They are mobilized this agreement before their country is even officially part of it. So what exactly can we do about these agreements? First of all, we can bring this message to Congress. This is a hearing where a few months ago, several of us, a hearing on TPP where several of us went to Congress and held silent vigil with shirts with messages like "Got Text," pointing out the fact that these are hearings on a trade agreement where no one has even read the text of it, the negotiating texts. We can hold our elected officials accountable when they sell out their own voters to the 1%. And let them know. Let people know who outsource their jobs. We put together these politician pink slips. We have them for different legislators. One side says Panama, Colombia, and South Korea free trade pink slip, and then underneath it says the big picture of the politician, and it says, in this case, Bob Turner says, "You're fired," and then on the back explains how these politicians contributed to the outsourcing of jobs. You can pass those around. Thanks. We need to go out to the voters in their own congressional districts and let them know how these politicians are doing the things that are endangering their futures. We need to expose the complicity of these corporations in these elected officials, same difference, in human rights atrocities. And we need to find key moments when to strike. This here is me being dragged out of Congressman Bob Turner's swearing-in ceremony. Strange case. This is the guy who was elected when Anthony Weiner disgraced himself. So he went right to Congress before having a swearing-in ceremony in Congress, and basically about a month into office, voted for all three of these trade agreements. I was there at the moment that he was being sworn in, and managed to shout him down and got tackled by the Incredible Hulk here, but he got some news coverage. We need to embrace the full range of constituencies who are concerned about these free trade agreements. It's not always the most obvious allies. Here are people who are concerned about the animal welfare impacts of expanding factory farming. And when people are killed, these politicians need to be named and need to be called out. Here, three of us are chained to the doors of Chuck Schumer's office about 4 days after the Bagua massacre in Peru. When I mentioned before that indigenous people rose up and were massacred for defending their lands. 4 days later, Chuck Schumer's building was blockaded. 1 year earlier, when Peruvian farmers rose up because the trade agreement was going to destroy their livelihood and 4 farmers were killed, we were chained to the doors of Hillary Clinton's office. We need to show solidarity with our allies in other countries, recognizing that people are fighting the same struggle overseas. In Korea, people have braved water cannon attacks and intense police brutality as tens of thousands have taken to the streets to oppose these trade agreements. Here we are outside the Korean consulate, expressing our solidarity and our shame at President Lee's abuse of his own people in the interest of free trade. We can use humor to educate. This is, I mentioned the Pacific Rim case before. Sorry for the slowness in the video. Kind of a long introduction.
CEO of the Pacific Rim Corporation, a giant Canadian company, and I'm here offering free samples of our new product, cyanide mineral water.
This is outside the Canadian consulate.
In El Salvador. Unfortunately, this poor third world country is denying us the right to pollute their water. And so we're suing them for $100 million. We're going to court on Monday, May 31st, in a free trade court. To cap the court. So we'd like to offer some free samples to our guests today. Free cyanide water from that big Canadian corporation, Pacific Rim Water in El Salvador. We're coming to a town near you. And we're suing the government of El Salvador, a little third world country, for $100 million. But they won't let us pollute. You want some cyanide water? Do you have a free sample today? Yes, we have a free sample today. It's El Dorado cyanide water. Wow. It's courtesy of the Pacific Rim Corporation. Yeah, we'd like you to try some. How is that? No, I can really taste this. Okay, would you like a little extra arsenic in that? Yes, arsenic. Oh, give me that water back. It's all for the good of the profits. So, would you like a free sample of cyanide water? You can try it. It's only $100 million. Here, let me give you a little extra spritz of cyanide. Okay. Be careful. Don't hit you. Hi, let's offer you some cyanide here today. I'm a representative of a giant Canadian corporation. My name is Constance. And pay no attention to the body. We're offering cyanide water from a Canadian corporation, Pacific Rim. We only pollute half the water in El Salvador. And we're suing them for $100 million. paying attention. Sometimes it takes a little longer for people to die from cyanide. We're offering 3 samples of cyanide water. We're a giant Canadian corporation. We use cyanide to mine gold in El Salvador. Pacific Rim, a true friend of death.
These are some of the member groups of our coalition. I don't even know what that phone number is. That's an old phone number. I don't think it still works. Maybe it does. I don't know. Okay. Next slide. Oh, sorry. It's going to do that on its own. One of the key... No, stop. Oy. Why does it want to do that? Okay, there we go. One of the key strategies for our coalition has been building ties with the people who know the best how these trade agreements are going to affect people overseas, immigrant communities. Free trade agreements are a driving force of immigration. When we passed NAFTA, we wiped out Mexican agriculture by basically allowing our industrially produced, subsidized, genetically modified crops to be dumped on the Mexican market, driving 2 million Mexican farmers out of work and creating a massive wave of immigration. The Mexican population of New York City has gone up 5 times since the passage of NAFTA. So the same politicians, of course, who are pushing these free trade agreements are talking about what a big problem immigration is. Not a little bit of hypocrisy there. And so we have allies in the Korean community. This is a Korean community forum with about, I think, 450 people in attendance for a progressive Korean blogger who's against the trade agreement, came to New York and invited us to speak with me as President Lee over there. Yes, actually. There's many. He asked if there are cases where we have artificially influenced the outcome of elections in other countries for the benefit of our trade agreements. Most definitely. Costa Rica is a pretty clear case of that, where President Arias was basically bribed on his way into office and then rigged the public referendum to decide whether the country was going to go into the trade agreement despite massive public opposition. The politicians who are bribed for these trade agreements need to be exposed. This is at the top picture is a town hall meeting yesterday where Congressman Joseph Crowley was speaking. Crowley has not voted against a free trade agreement since 2006. Here he is grasping for the Citigroup money. A little over a week earlier, we were outside his birthday fundraiser, holding our own birthday fundraiser on behalf of his corporate donors. There he is holding up his bags of money with his good friends around him. There you have Chuck Schumer in the back there as the MC. He was one of the guests of honor at the event. We think it is very important, and I'm sure folks here would agree, to not fall into the trap of lesser evils and thinking that we should be any more tolerant of people when they sell us out just because they are Democrats. Occupy Wall Street has been subject to an aggressive campaign by the right, and to some degree by the Democrats, to paint us as friends of the Democratic Party, to paint us as a tool of the Obama administration. Obama famously said, people like us are the reason he ran for president in the first place. I guess he meant to screw over people like us. But so here we are outside the Apollo Theater with about 500 people protesting Obama. The video is terrible here, I apologize. This is a public meeting where one of our members is calling out 2 congressional representatives. Okay. Yeah, sound quality is very poor. We'll just skip that. It's a shame. It's a good speech, but it's not coming through well. Obama, in particular, needs to be called out both for his votes for these past trade agreements and his push now for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Here we are outside of the corporate office of Pfizer. While the Trans-Pacific Partnership was holding meetings in California, we were outside Pfizer in New York talking about the $80,000 in lobbying money they spent to ensure intellectual property rules that benefit them in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Korea FTA. And you can see we have Obama's being handed Obama Pfizer bucks over there by Pfizer. We need to challenge the secrecy of TPP and what an affront it is to democracy. And we need to bring this message home to Bergen County, which of course has already been occupied for a very long time. This is the choice we're presented in this upcoming primary. Our two stalwart friends, Bill Pasquale, who voted for the Peru and Panama trade agreements, and Steve Rothman, who voted for the Panama and South Korea free trade agreements. What a choice. It's like a choice between a firing squad or the electric chair. We in Bergen County need better places to get together. I don't know that the Garden State Plaza or the Giant Stadium are going to be where the revolution is going to come from. Maybe somewhere like this might be a good place to get a couple thousand people together. Nice convenient square right across the street. Maybe there's a need for some tents right there. Steve Rothman's office is right over there.
Yeah.
And we should remember, the media loves Occupy. Even when they're bashing us, they're still covering us. Well, it's true. It's not been as much coverage as there had been. But I think Bergen County would, I think the Record would love to have the opportunity to do some Occupy stories. And I think if Steve Rothman had some tents outside his office, that would probably get a few front pages. It's up to all of us. We do have an opportunity to derail this Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is absolutely accountable that the politicians be called out for how they voted on this last set of trade agreements, because if we don't do that, if we say that's over and we need to move on to the next thing, then it sends the message to them that they can get away with it. As Joe can attest, we brought a range of constituents to Rothman's office. We had people from the Korean community elders, was a phone conference actually, meeting with his staff, begging them not to pass this trade agreement. Rothman didn't give a damn because, he knew where his bread was buttered, and he can't get away with that. The Dallas round of Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations is coming up in May. This is a critical time to raise this issue. People are talking about a massive mobilization to Dallas, maybe another Seattle. We need to get this word out, use the internet, let everyone know these negotiations are going on, not let them maintain the secret. And we need to get in the politicians' faces. And let's hope this video loads. Yeah, it didn't load. Oh well, that was going to be a nice concluding video. Let me see if I can pull it up separately. There's supposed to be about 7 more videos in there, but given the time, it's probably a good thing to help them out. So, it's getting late. Oh well, it's not going to load, don't worry about it. So, okay, so I guess in the absence of that video, we'll just wrap up there. Again, I strongly encourage all of you to join the fight against these trade agreements. We will be happy to support local efforts in Bergen County. We can help you produce locally relevant literature. We can discuss strategy. Let's bring this issue home. Workers in Bergen County are certainly going to be adversely affected by these trade agreements. And what's that? I rarely find anyone who deserves it. Perhaps if there was someone who actually deserved it, I live in Carolyn Maloney's district. I'm sure as hell not going to vote for her. Perhaps if someone ran against her who actually believed in something other than outsourcing jobs and causing unemployment, I might vote for that person. If we could just. Very quickly.
Does this contain your telephone number?
That our contact information is on there. Ruth, do you know where the sign-up sheets are?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we can just get those going around. Other questions?
Yeah, well, one, I'm actually running for Congress here. I'm Diane Sayre. I'm a LaRouche Democrat. I didn't ask for the party endorsement because I'm calling for Obama's impeachment for these, among other reasons, the NDAA. But I'm really glad you brought up the Korea thing because I had a meeting with the Korean press, and they told me they have had both Rothman, Castro, and Garrett, and all of them supported the Korean Free Trade Agreement, and they were very shocked that I didn't. But I didn't actually know the content, except I know in general these things are horrible. So I would definitely like to get more information. I also have a question on whether your group is working on the question of the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, because that really would bankrupt a lot of these Wall Street institutions right away. And as you probably know, it is a bill in the Congress right now with 58 co-sponsors.
Yeah, it's not something we're working on. I mean, I agree with you. It's a very important issue. Yeah, I didn't mention Garrett throughout this presentation because I just figured pretty much everyone would assume that if there was something he could vote wrong on, he would. So.
The first of these major recent trade agreements, of course, was NAFTA. And that was passed in 1993. Now, Bill Clinton, when he campaigned for the presidency in '92, said he would not support the ratification of the NAFTA agreement unless it did include adequate protections for labor and the environment. And he put in a couple of letters that meant nothing, and then pushed Congress to ratify it, something the elder Bush was not able to do, Republican. Clinton, the Democrat, was able to do it. But the way he did it was against the opposition of a great deal of opposition, including the AFL-CIO, which he then publicly condemned as president, which I've never heard of any president doing before that. At any rate, the question I want to raise is this. That agreement was adopted by both houses of Congress, and in the House of Representatives, there were only a couple of vote difference between those who voted for it and those who voted against it. I think the vote was 218 to 216. And some of those positive votes were obtained by Clinton bribing members of Congress. Now, has your organization, or any, raised the question that all of these trade agreements that have been adopted are adopted against the Constitution, because these are international treaties, and the Constitution requires that a treaty with foreign nations must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, not by a simple majority of both the Senate and the House?
It's a very interesting question. And you'll notice that they call these free trade agreements. There is a very specific reason they do that. They claim that they're not treaties. What's interesting though is if you look on the other side, what they're called in Latin America, TLC. That te is for the Spanish word for treaty. So to us they're not treaties, but to the people we're passing them with, they're treaties. We treat them like treaties. They apparently supersede our national laws, but they claim they're not treaties. And that's exactly how they get around that, and that's exactly why they're called what they're called.
That what they're doing is fraud, and it is a direct violation of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's kind of an end run around the Constitution. I mean, the whole affront to democracy in these agreements is just obscene. The first video mentioned fast track a little bit, which is something I didn't get into. The way fast track works, the separation of powers is supposed to be set up so that that international treaties are international agreements are those powers are divided. The executive negotiates them. Congress votes on them. That way, the people actually are supposed to, in theory, have some say in what goes on. Well, they figured out a way around that. They set up something called fast track. The way fast track works is this: The president negotiates the trade agreement. The president then, under this fast-track legislation, what's called Trade Promotion Authority, sends the legislation to be voted on in Congress. Congress then has 90 days to vote on the legislation, and they can do one of two things with it. They can vote it up, or they can vote it down. Now, what legislation works like that? Any other legislation, it goes through amendments, it goes through markups, it goes through a whole process where it can be changed in the process. Things can be added, things can be taken out. These trade agreements, they can't do any of that. I mean, it goes through committees, but it's meaningless. They just rubber stamp it. It is required to be voted on within 90 days. Nothing is like that. Now, Nancy Pelosi, when the Peru agreement was headed for a vote, the Colombia agreement was headed for a vote, sorry, Bush basically decided that he would screw the Democrats and make them vote on the Colombia agreement in an election year, so that a lot of Democrats would have to vote against labor and hurt their chances of being reelected, or screw the corporations. Pelosi basically decided to just break the rules because it was going to be politically bad to do that. So they just ignored fast track. I don't know how she got away with it, but she got away with it. But normally fast track pretty much defines how these things are voted on. Completely cuts any kind of democratic input out of the process. The president negotiates it, the president ignores us, the president and Congress votes on it. And the way they usually get voted on of late is they get them through the House with a majority of Democrats opposing them, but a minority of Democrats, including usually, well, with Peru at least, the Democratic leadership, in coalition with a majority of Republicans and a minority of Democrats, pulling in more votes than the majority of Democrats. Even when they managed to do that even when the Democrats had both houses. But of course, part of that is because the Senate Democrats are awful. But sorry, other questions?
I have a question. My name is Lewis. I also work with Diane Sayre for the congressional campaign.
Okay.
And out of curiosity, I see you're protesting a lot of different activities, different groups, things you've done a lot of meticulous research on. I mentioned this in the context of what we're fighting for, which is a Glass-Steagall banking reorganization, coupled with a massive national banking institution investment into massive infrastructure. Like we're emphasizing a project called NAWAPA, which will move water from Alaska to southern parts of the country. I want to hear from you, what have you in your group been discussing what solutions to fight for in terms of how do we actually get this country away from the trajectory of a complete total economic collapse of the system?
That's a question that would probably require a long answer. Yeah, I mean, as a coalition, I think a lot of the groups in our coalition have very different visions of what the alternatives look like. Some of the people in our coalition are inspired by some of the alternatives that have come out of Latin America through for example, the ALBA, which is an alliance of progressive South American nations that have tried to form a bloc as a counter to U.S. hegemony. Some of the people in our coalition feel strongly that we need to move towards more localized, sustainable economies. We don't necessarily agree with the solutions, or what we do agree is that we need to stop this steamroller of undemocratic trade agreements that are really attacking all of our efforts to create a world where corporations aren't running everything at the expense of all of us.
Quick follow-up, how would you change the United States?
How would I change the United States?
Yeah, in this regard.
Well, how I would change the United States, again, and how other people in our coalition might answer that question would be different answers. I could go into some length about my own personal answers, but I wouldn't be speaking for anyone but me. I mean, and the organization I represent in our coalition. We encompass a range of groups. We have groups in our coalition who's basically concerned about keeping jobs in the U.S., and that's really all they're concerned about. We have groups who are focused on international solidarity. We have groups who are radical environmental groups. They might disagree on any 10 other things, but they do agree that these, they probably agree on a lot of things too. But one thing they definitely agree on is that these trade agreements are a disaster. There's a slogan, idea that came out of, I think, the Zapatistas, which is one no, many yeses. That there are many answers and many alternatives, but one neoliberal model that we all need to fight. And it's important, and we actually try not to focus, we've talked about it, but we tend not to get into too much depth about what the solution would be, because that's not where our point of unity is. Our point of unity is recognizing that that we have a common enemy. and that we need to create more democratic space, more space for the public to actually create policy, so that we have the room to talk about solutions, so that we the people are the ones defining what the alternatives should be, and that we can start having those conversations about what we should have instead. Because at this point, those conversations are largely academic. We're not the ones making the rules, so it's great. We could have a better idea. We could have a different sense of what things should be, but as long as we're locked out of the process, it almost doesn't matter. Other questions?
Okay, I think we need to wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you all for staying so long.
Gary's going to present you a pat with a token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
So great. Dude, really, I need a website. It's not a bottle. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Organic, and there's a scholarship.
Thank you. Well, certainly a fair trade product is a very perfect gift. Thank you. Thank you so much.
May I ask a question?
And we should wrap it
These
up.
three trade agreements, what is their current status? When are they going to be voted on? What's the prognosis?
Okay, real quick wrap-up answer. Panama, Colombia, and South Korea have all been voted on. They're at different points in terms of actual implementation. They're moving towards implementation. There's a gap between the vote and the implementation. As I said earlier, Obama is talking about potentially pulling the trigger on Colombia at the Summit for the Americas this week. There have been massive protests in Korea around the implementation phase of the Korea Agreement. I've heard less about what's happening with the Panama implementation. Trans-Pacific Partnership is still in negotiations. We have the chance to derail that before it ever gets to Congress if we do that work now. But we also need to join the AFL-CIO and others who've called for for the Colombia trade agreement to not be implemented, because even since the passage of the trade agreement, there have been even more killings.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and we'll see you at another forum in the future. Stop by next month to help us plan the next one.
And we have some publications up here with more information on the issues that I talked about, if you'd like to read more about this.